For over half a century, France called itself the protector of Africa, the guardian of its former colonies. From Dakar to Niamey, from Bamako to Ouagadougou, France maintained military bases, economic control, and political leverage. It called this partnership Franc-Afrique, a special relationship built on cooperation. But in reality, for many Africans, it was not cooperation, it was control. France dictated currency policy, shaped elections, intervened in wars, and controlled resources. And now, after decades of promises and manipulation, West Africa is rising in anger. In just a few years, one country after another, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, has cut ties, expelled French troops, and accused Paris of destabilizing their nations. This is the story of how France's influence turned from friendship to fury, and how it left a trail of resentment and revolt across West Africa. The story begins in the early 1960s, when France granted independence to its African colonies. But independence came with conditions. France offered security, aid, and support, but in exchange, African leaders had to stay loyal to Paris. Defense pacts were signed that allowed French soldiers to remain on African soil. French companies kept control of gold mines, uranium, oil, and telecommunications. And African economies were tied to the CFA franc, a currency guaranteed and controlled by the French treasury. In return, France promised stability. It portrayed itself as Africa's big brother, a guiding hand in a dangerous world. But as decades passed, the truth became clear. France wasn't guiding, it was holding back. The CFA franc became the symbol of France's invisible power. Every time an African country using this currency traded internationally, its reserves sat in the French treasury. The value of their money was pegged to the euro, and therefore to France's economic decisions. Supporters said it kept economies stable, but for millions of Africans, it became a daily reminder of dependence, a colonial ghost still haunting their pockets. Countries like Senegal, Benin, and Ivory Coast began questioning why their financial destiny was still tied to Paris decades after independence. Meanwhile, protests erupted demanding a new currency, one that reflected Africa's sovereignty. In response, France promised reforms, the creation of the ECO, a new West African currency. But critics saw it as another illusion. Same structure, same control, just a new name. The economic leash had not been cut, only disguised. From the very beginning, France justified its military presence as protection. It claimed to help its former colonies fight terrorism and instability. In 2013, French forces launched Operation Serval in Mali to stop jihadist insurgents. At first, they were welcomed as heroes. But 10 years later, that enthusiasm turned into resentment. Malians began asking, if France's army is here to help, why are the attacks getting worse? If France is our ally, why does it act like our master? In 2014, France expanded its mission into Operation Barkhane, a massive anti-terror campaign stretching across the Sahel. But instead of peace, the region descended into chaos. Thousands died, entire villages were destroyed, and France was accused of choosing sides, supporting corrupt elites, and exploiting security crises to maintain control. By 2022, public anger had exploded. Across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, protests erupted. Young people filled the streets waving their national flags and burning French ones. Their message was clear: France, get out of Africa. For years, France had lectured Africans about democracy and freedom. But when people demanded that same freedom from France, they were met with silence or sanctions. In Mali, protesters accused France of manipulating leaders and using terrorism as an excuse to stay. In Burkina Faso, citizens blamed French interference for failing to stop jihadist attacks. In Niger, the final straw came when French soldiers refused to leave despite the government's demand. For many Africans, France was no longer a friend. It had become a foreign occupier. The rejection of France did not come from protests alone. It came through coups. In Mali, in 2020 and again in 2021, the military seized power, accusing the French-backed government of corruption and weakness. The new leaders expelled French troops and welcomed new partners, especially Russia. A year later, Burkina Faso followed. Its soldiers ousted President Roch Kabore, declaring that France had failed to protect the country from terrorism. The new government immediately began cutting ties with Paris. Then came Niger, in 2023. The democratically elected president, Mohamed Bazoum, was removed by the army. Crowds cheered in the capital, Niamey, shouting, "Down with France." They accused Paris of exploiting Niger's uranium and using the country as a military base while its people remained poor. Within months, France's last major military presence in the Sahel was gone. By 2024, the once powerful French army had been pushed out of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Its bases were closed, its flags lowered. Even Senegal, long considered Paris's closest ally, announced it would end permanent French military bases. For France, this was a geopolitical earthquake. It had lost nearly all strategic footholds in West Africa, not through war, but through rejection. African nations had turned the tables. What France once called partnerships were now seen as chains. What France called help was now seen as manipulation. And in the eyes of millions of Africans, the departure of French troops was not a loss, it was a liberation. France tried to fight back, not with weapons, but with words. It accused Russia and China of spreading anti-French propaganda. It claimed the coups were fueled by disinformation. But the reality was simpler. Africans had lost faith in France long before Russia or China arrived. What France saw as manipulation, Africans saw as awakening. Meanwhile, new alliances formed. Russia's Wagner Group provided military support to Mali and Burkina Faso. Turkey expanded its trade and education networks. China continued building roads, bridges, and railways, quietly, but effectively. France's monopoly on Africa was broken. Facing rejection, France changed its tone. President Emmanuel Macron announced that Françafrique, the old system of dominance, was over. He promised a new relationship based on respect and partnership. But on the ground, few believed him. Cultural centers continued promoting French language and values. Aid and investment still came with conditions. And the memory of military occupation was still fresh. The truth is, France's influence may be transforming, but it is far from gone. It now operates through soft power, culture, language, and economic pressure, rather than soldiers. Yet, young Africans are no longer enchanted by France's promises. They are building their own media, startups, and identities, in their own languages, on their own terms. A new Africa is speaking. In the streets of Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou, people are no longer silent. They question the past, they debate the future, and they refuse to be lectured about democracy by the same power that once colonized them. Social media has become the new battlefield, not of bullets, but of ideas. African youth use platforms like TikTok and YouTube to expose injustice, corruption, and foreign interference. For them, rejecting France is not just politics, it is identity. It is reclaiming dignity that was stolen generations ago. The fall of French influence does not mean the rise of peace. West Africa still faces enormous challenges: terrorism, poverty, unemployment, and weak governance. Replacing France with Russia or China will not automatically solve those problems. But the coups have changed something fundamental. They have shattered the illusion that Africa cannot stand on its own. For the first time in decades, nations like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are making their own choices, whether good or bad, without asking for France's permission. The Sahel is unstable, yes, but it is also awakening. France once claimed to be Africa's savior. Now, it struggles to be accepted even as a guest. From the fall of French bases to the burning of French flags, the message from West Africa is unmistakable. We will no longer be ruled, not by soldiers, not by money, and not by fear. France's retreat marks the end of an era, the collapse of Françafrique and the birth of a new African confidence. The path ahead will not be easy. But for millions of Africans, it is finally their path, their future, their freedom, their voice. The French shadow that once stretched over West Africa is fading. And in its place, the light of independence, long delayed, but never forgotten, is rising once again. Follow and subscribe us for getting more deeply documentaries on time.